Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm honored to introduce today's program, the Jewish Diaspora, Latin American Stories. I also would like to thank the Hispanic Society of America for co-presenting today's program. Joining us today are Dr. Marian Kaplan, Dr. Yael Simon, Dr. Leo Spitzer, and Dr. Adriana Brodsky. They will be in conversation with Simon Romero. Dr. Marian Kaplan is the Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at New York University. She's a three-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award for her books, The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Women, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, and Gender and Jewish History, co-edited with Deborah Moore. Dr. Yael Simon is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Political Sciences at the Iberoamericana University, Mexico. She has recently co-written chapters in two books, Migration Narratives of Holocaust Survivors in Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, and the Holocaust in the 21st Century, Relevance and Challenges in the Digital Age, and Holocaust Survivors in Mexico, Intersecting and Conflicting Narratives of Open Doors, Welcome Society, and Personal Hardships, and Conceptualizing Mass Violence, Representations, Recollections, and Reinterpretations. Dr. Leo Spitzer is the K.T. Vernon Professor of History Emeritus and Research Professor at Dartmouth College. He is the author of several books, including Ghosts of Home, The Afterlife of Czernowitz and Jewish Memory, Hotel Bolivia, The Cultural Memory of in a Refuge from Nazism, and Acts of Memory, Cultural Recall in the Present. Dr. Adriana Brodsky is a professor of history at St. Mary's College of Maryland. She has written several books and monographs, including Sephardi, Jewish, Argentine, Community and National Identity, 1880 to 1960, and The New Jewish Argentina, Facets of Jewish Experiences in the Southern Cone, which won the 2013 Latin American Jewish Studies Association Book Prize. Simon Romero, who will be our moderator, is a national correspondent for the New York Times, covering immigration and other issues. At the Times, he has previously served as the Brazil Bureau Chief and Andean Bureau Chief. He has also written for America Economia, in Brazil and Bloomberg News in Brazil. Simon is currently based in Albuquerque. During the discussion, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. Also, please note that this program may last up to 90 minutes. Thank you all again for being here, and I'm now going to hand things over to Simon.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Sydney. It is really just a great pleasure to be here with all of you today and to discuss a subject that is that's very dear to my heart. As you mentioned, Sydney, I got just the rare opportunity to roam around Latin America for the New York Times, and some places that I stopped just were so fascinating, and some of the places that I wrote about, such as Moisesville in the interior of Argentina, where you had just the incredibly rich history of Jewish migration and settlement right there on the Pampas. I wrote about Venezuela's Jewish community, which underwent a lot of changes over the past 2 decades, and many people have left that country, of course. And I got the chance in Brazil to go to places like Petrópolis, where the great writer, Stefan Zweig is buried, and he coined the term, country of the future in the great book that he wrote while in refuge and exile in Brazil. So we have so much to cover today, really, and I'm so eager to get things started. I'm going to hand it off to Adriana Brodsky, who has written so widely about experiences in Argentina. Adriana, please go ahead.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be part of this wonderful group of scholars talking a little bit about the Jewish diaspora in Latin America, an area that doesn't tend to receive as much attention as the bigger countries of the North, like the United States and Canada. So it's good to be here reminding people that a lot of Jewish people chose, some of these areas south of the Rio Grande to live in and to create important communities. I'm going to start just by giving you a sense of where the Argentine community stood in the 1930s. And Argentina was home to the third largest Jewish population in the continent, certainly after the United States and Canada, but the first, as I mentioned, in the rest of the continent, with about 200,000 people. But of course, immigration, had started a while back in the 19th century, as soon as the civil wars, independence first from Spain, and then civil wars that rocked the region in the second half or mid to second half of the 19th century. And initially, it was a very slow, immigration. There were just a few, usually representatives of European companies that moved to Argentina to act as the representatives. But it certainly picked up after the 1890s with the founding, as we heard from Simon, with the founding of the Jewish agricultural colonies that were set up by the Jewish Colonization Association, a European Jewish organization founded by Baron Hirsch with the intention of creating spaces or founding spaces where the Jews persecuted, in Russia could find a respite and settle and find a place of rest. And in Argentina, that was what is usually agreed upon as the date of the beginning of the massive immigration movement to the country, with these mostly Russian Jews, as I mentioned, escaping the pogroms that had started in the late 19th century in the Russian Empire. And indeed, the colonies initially were the areas that welcomed and settled the largest numbers of Jews. But while at around 1895, right, 66% of all the Jews that lived in Argentina, 66% lived in the colonies. By the 1930s, and here I'm returning back to the picture that I'm trying to give you in the 1930s, by the 1930s, the Jewish gauchos, those Russian Jews who had come to these agricultural colonies, only accounted for 10% of the Jewish community in Argentina as a whole. So Argentina, in a sense, started, right, as a place that welcomed and prepared and trained Jews in the arts of agriculture, let's say. But the 1930s, the Jewish community had really reverted to an urban, to an urban community. And by the 1930s, we can see, even though there will be, future waves of immigrants later on, we do see that the Argentine Jewish community by the 1930s is very diverse. On the one hand, there are Jews who are both Ashkenazi from the Russian Empire, Poland, and other regions in the Ashkenazi world, as well as Sephardim, which is actually the area that I research the most in my academic life. And these Sephardi Jews, who were likely not more than 20 to 25% of the Jewish community as a whole, actually came from former Ottoman lands, both Ladino speakers and Arabic speakers, as well as from areas from Morocco, as well as from other Mediterranean countries like Italy, like Greece, etc. Now, these groups, both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, were also varied in terms of social class, in terms of political activity, and in terms of also of their religious orientation, in terms of secular Jews, as well as much more religious groups. By the early 1930s, as news about the rise of Hitler arrived, the Argentine Jewish community was finalizing its process of consolidation. And in fact, one could argue that the need to address the rise of Nazism in Europe, as well as some local instances of nativism furthered that process of consolidation. And on the one hand, it allowed a much more effective communication between the Argentine community and the government, but also it provided the structure with which to gather together and to raise funds and to start helping the Jewish brothers and sisters who were suffering the rise of Nazism in Europe. Now, by the 30s, as many other countries in Latin America, the initial open doors that these countries had instituted in terms of outside immigration were beginning to not close off completely, but they were, it was much more difficult by a combination of the Depression and some nativist, ideology. It was a little bit more complicated for people to cross, to enter the country. But that again, right, because these restrictions were not complete, one could argue, right, that an important number of Jews also was able to arrive in Argentina, both during the 30s and even, of course, in much smaller numbers during the Holocaust. And I'm going to finish just with a discussion that goes back to getting together Jews from Argentina, getting together with other Jews around the Americas to fight the rise of Nazism. In 1941, the Jewish communities around the Americas met in Baltimore to discuss the issue of refugees and thinking about what these nations in the Americas, what these American Jewish communities could do, to help what they understood was a huge number of refugees that needed a home. Led by the World Jewish Congress, an institution that was housed in New York, the American Jewish community mostly asked the Jewish communities all around the continent to put pressure on their own countries so that America, not the United States, because of its limitations with the 1924 law, so that these, Latin American nations could, provide a refuge for those Jews that were going to be in need of a home. And so I'm going to leave it here because I think that this gives a good sort of segue into, in particular, the case that Marian will talk about, but I think also for Leo's presentation on the Jewish community in Bolivia. So if that's all right, I'll just let you guys take over from here.
That's wonderful. Adriana, thank you. So fascinating. And I'm looking forward into our discussion to hear more about the Sephardic community in Argentina, especially. But what you mentioned is certainly a great point of transition into our next presentation from Marian, looking at the Dominican Republic and at the very special experience in Sosua, which of course looks very different now than it did back in the 40s. And Adriana, as you mentioned, I mean, there were policies that were implemented in the United States which really shut down access to the U.S. for many of these refugee families, and they had to look elsewhere, and the DR was one of those places. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Marian, please.
Thank you.
What can you tell us about Sosua?
Thanks. I'm going to start even farther back than Adriana did. So the first practicing Jews to arrive on the Spanish side of the island arrived in the first quarter of the 19th century from other Caribbean islands. Sephardic Jews, most had followed a typical path over some generations: expulsion from Spain or Portugal, migration to the Netherlands, and subsequent business travel and settlement in Curacao, from where they moved to Santo Domingo, which was the name of the country until its independence from Haiti in 1844. By the 1830s, these Jews constituted a small group of successful merchants. Their numbers increased slightly when some European Jews joined them. Sort of similar to court Jews in Europe who lent money to and helped the finances of noble families, local Jewish businessmen supported Dominican governments. Jewish merchants sided with the Dominicans when Haiti, invaded the Dominican part of the island in 1822, and they helped finance the Dominican War of Independence in 1844. Officially tolerated like Protestants, Jews even entered the civil service. In 1861, President Santana returned the Dominican Republic to Spanish rule. Fearing Spanish intolerance, Jews again supported the Dominican side in what became the War of Restoration against Spain. With Dominican victory and a period of relative peace, many Jews intermarried, integrated into elite circles. Most became liberal Christian Dominicans who continued to call themselves Hebreos. In 1882, when pogroms and economic desperation uprooted masses of Russian Jews in the late 19th century, Gregorio Luperon, an Afro-Dominican general and minister plenipotentiary to Western Europe, invited Jewish refugees to the Dominican Republic, promising them religious freedom along with, quote, a maximum degree of rights. Although few came, those Jews already there had no need to hide their Jewish heritage, even if converted. So now we turn to Europe. With the beginning of the Nazi era in 1933, a refugee crisis exploded as Jews fled their homelands. By 1938, Roosevelt announced that he had invited 32 countries to attend a conference on the refugee emergency at Evian, France. At the conference, a Newsweek journalist wrote, quote, most governments acted promptly by slamming their doors against Jewish refugees. Yet shortly after Evian, the Dominican government made a confidential offer of land for settlement. It proposed to receive 50,000 to 100,000 settlers, as long as the immigrants could become agricultural settlers. At the time, this proposal seemed, quote, little short of a miracle. In hindsight, the offer looks even better, considering that by that time, the war broke out, and by the time the war broke out, and only 95,000 Jews had entered the United States, and 60,000 had gone to Palestine. When US experts agreed that the Dominican Republic could settle up to about 29,000 families and recommended an experiment of 200 families, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the Joint as it was called, set up DORSA, the Dominican Republic Settlement Association. Most crucially, the Dominican government cooperated, intending to make the refugee settlement successful. Rafael Trujillo, its notorious dictator, even donated 26,000 acres of his own land, although DORSA insisted that he take stock shares in exchange. They didn't want it for free. The settlement of Sosua consisted of an 8-mile beach, cultivable land, grazing areas, mountain areas of forest, and over 20 buildings. Why did the Dominicans extend a welcoming hand? With the support of the United States, Trujillo took over the helm of the Dominican Republic in 1930 and ran it as his own personal possession until 1961. He terrorized and murdered opponents, broke unions, owned 50 to 60% of the arable land, and to a large degree controlled butter, cattle, milk, and salt industries. It became one of the world's richest men. There are many theories to consider as to why he offered a safe haven, but I'll mention only the three most prominent. First, and of most immediacy, was the Dominican massacre of Haitians in October 1937. The numbers were staggering, with estimates fluctuating between 12,000 and 20,000. In an ethnic cleansing that preceded the rape of Nanking by 2 months and the Holocaust by less than 4 years, Haitians were cut down with machetes, bayonets, and clubs. Thus, Trujillo's gesture toward the refugees was an attempt to recover in world opinion. A second reason for his largesse may have been that Trujillo's genocide had depopulated the land and left crops untended and reduced harvests. He may have hoped that the refugees would make up for Haitian farmers while bringing in needed capital with which to increase agricultural production. Jewish organizations, specifically those in the US, would supply the money. the machinery, and the subsistence of the new settlers till they got on their own feet. The Dominicans would thus derive symbolic and real capital. Third, whiteness played a role. Trujillo's obsessive concern to transform the Dominican Republic into a, quote, white country further explains his invitation to people considered racially inferior by their own governments. Many of the people who negotiated the Dorsa contract with the regime, as well as those who benefited from it, understood who Trujillo was. Louis Hess, who later ran the small school in Sosua, summed it up. I quote, "Did we have a choice? Hitler, the German racist, persecuted us and wanted to murder us. Trujillo, the Dominican racist, saved our lives. We were in the awkward position of having to be thankful to a dictator." So who arrived in Sosua? The first small group of 9 pioneers, as they called themselves, arrived in March 1940. A larger group arrived in May, consisting of 37 people coming from Switzerland. These settlers, with little to no agricultural training, had to sign a statement that declared they confirmed that they were going to Santo Domingo to permanently remain in the settlement of the Dorsa, and under no conditions for a temporary stay. This statement would assuage both the Dominicans who sought permanent commitments and the Americans who hoped to limit Jewish migration to the United States. Happily, most refugees had positive first impressions of Sosua. Miriam Sundheimer's trip there, a 12-mile car ride from Puerto Plata over bumpy roads, took 45 minutes. And today it's like 8 minutes. And passed through sugar plantations, palm forests, and tropical plants she had never seen. Horst Wagner described the nerve-wracking trip from Ciudad Trujillo, which was the capital Trujillo named after himself, which took over 7 hours, takes over 7 hours today, but he drove for many, many more hours over roads that got narrower and and surfaces that became more and more rutted, with huge holes filled with water, breeding places for mosquitoes, he would later learn. When they arrived in Sosua, they had a wonderful view. Quote, "Before us lay the ocean with a snow-white beach. We were thrilled." They observed that Sosua was very clean. The houses and barracks, housing about 60 people, even came with electrical lights and outdoor toilets and cold water showers. Next door to the barracks, they found another small building that served as a kitchen, dining room, and laundry. By the end of 1940, about 250 refugees lived in Sosua, the majority Austrian and German. These barracks, the main store, medical clinics, schools, small shops, etc., were situated in a small area known as Batay, the nucleus of the village. And it provided jobs for those who came with the refugees but couldn't farm, mostly elderly parents. Some distance from Batay stood old stone houses or newly built ones intended to serve couples and single women. Grateful for their lives, these new farmers, mostly urbanites, needed to learn about farming and train for suitable jobs. Many approached their new jobs with frustration and humor. Kurt Teller's first assignment landed him in the community chicken farm. He hated feathered animals, couldn't eat chicken or smell it without getting sick. Now he had to touch them, kill them, and pluck them. Writing in 1944, he noted he had also learned to work fields and search for caterpillars. Wagner first toiled in the stable, fed the calves, and remarked with pleasure when the calves recognized him. But calves had to be led to their mothers, and if someone brought the wrong calf, quote, "the cow got very angry and kicked both you and the calf." After some months of practical and theoretical introduction to farming in Spanish, some of the settlers were ready to leave the barracks and embark on a homestead, a small farm. Since it was clear that not everyone could succeed as a homesteader, Dorsa also developed communal farming, cooperative production and marketing, similar to a kibbutz, but with people who had no ideological belief in such a system. Despite some successes, especially meat and dairy industries, They were stymied by their biggest problem, getting enough settlers to the DR in the middle of war. The lack of transportation out of Europe, and I have to underline this, the purposeful foot dragging of the United States government slowed the number of refugees able to come to the DR. Moreover, although President Roosevelt approved of the Sosua project, the refugees required transit visas from the US before entering the DR, and the State Department purposely moved excruciatingly slowly. By early 42, Dorsa realized there would be no more refugees until the war ended. Hence, the goal of Sosua changed from rescue to the possibility of post-war haven. Still, as welcoming as the DR appeared to be, and as grateful as the settlers were for their lives, they faced intractable difficulties. Farming was very hard. Mosquitoes swarmed the area, as did malaria. And ultimately, they couldn't succeed without the help of Dominican workers from nearby. The disparity between the number of single men and single women proved a major obstacle. Dorsa had invited far more men than women, hoping that strong young men would withstand the hard work. Wives, however, I would argue, were crucial to a homestead and to the growth of families and communities. Greeting new arrivals in February 1941, a young man on horseback asked, quote, "Didn't you bring any girls?" Dorsa estimated about 1/5 of the married couples in 1951 were intermarriages with Dominican women, and that's a significant number. Thus, once the war ended, the population declined. Many had seen Sosua as a temporary refuge, while others grew discouraged with the difficulties there. Still, others hoped to rejoin families left behind. They lived on an island, cut off from the world. They did not suspect the worst. Thus, they celebrated D-Day, but worried as, quote, few letters from loved ones trickled in. Generally, those settlers who had succeeded in maintaining their farms stayed, whereas the majority left after the war. Most went to North America and some to Latin America. And today, the settlement no longer exists, although some of its residents and their children remain. Yet every person who found a home in Sosua was saved from the Nazi genocide by the Dominican Republic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marian. So interesting to hear what was happening in the DR and the Dominican Republic in those years. And there's a real parallel story to what was happening all the way, in the Andes, in Bolivia at the same time, for similar reasons, yet it played out quite differently. And that's what we're going to hear from Leo right now, to kind of explain what was going on in La Paz and Cochabamba and Oruro and other cities in Bolivia, and why where the expression Hotel Bolivia came from. So Leo, off to you.
Thank you, Simon. Let me just begin by stating that my parents were Austrian Jewish refugees who fled to Bolivia in June of 1939. I was, as my mother explained to me, conceived in Vienna and born in La Paz in September 39, which was actually, I was born 10 days after the start of World War II. What I'd like to do in the brief time that I have is I'd like to focus briefly on this Jewish refugee experience in Bolivia and explore an important, but I think what is often a neglected aspect of the experience of group displacement, the relationship between memory and cultural survival during an era of persecution and genocide. Before the rise of Nazism in Central Europe, very few Jews, perhaps really less than 100, settled in Bolivia in the 20th century. European travelers visiting Bolivia in the early decades of the 20th century considered Bolivia the least Europeanized of the South American nations. But starting in the mid-1930s and up until the end of the first year of World War II, thousands of refugees from Nazi-dominated Central Europe, the majority of them Jews, fled to Bolivia. Indeed, in that period, the panic month following the German Anschluss of Austria in March of 1938, and Kristallnacht in November of that same year, Bolivia was one of the very few remaining places in the world to accept Jewish refugees. In that short period between then and the end of the first year of the war, some 20,000 refugees entered Bolivia. That was an immigration that was larger than that to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India combined, by the way. In Bolivia, the refugees began to reconstruct a version of the world that they had been forced to abandon. Significantly, they employed both nostalgic and what I call critical memory to accomplish this. Their own origins and social situations have been diverse in Central Europe. They ranged across generational, class, educational, political differences. Although most who came to Bolivia were Jews or were married to Jews, a significant minority were non-Jewish political refugees. So there were communists, socialists, and others that were persecuted by the Nazi regime. Jews themselves differed greatly in the degree of their identification with their religion and its traditions. They shared a common identity of Jews, one might say, perhaps because they had all been defined as Jews from the outside, that the Nazis, in a sense, othered them as Jews. But no matter what their background differences have been in Europe, the vast majority of refugees arrived in South America in dire straits, with very few personal possessions, very little money. And this had a leveling effect, cutting across their previous class distinctions. But there were other factors that helped to create a sense of collective identity among them, aiding in their adjustment, aiding in their survival. Their common history of persecution was certainly one of these. Each and every one of the refugees had been identified as undesirable, had been stripped of citizenship and possessions. Despite differences in details of their particular experiences, they were all, in a sense, in the same boat. The war back in Europe, the fact that so many had relatives and friends from whom they had been separated, was also an ever-present reality of which they were collectively conscious, and which bonded them together. They kept themselves and each other informed of news about the war from accounts in the press and radio. They shared efforts to discover the fate of those who were left behind. And in this regard, the German language, which they spoke at home and among themselves, served as a main vehicle of inquiry, of information and unity. It allowed them to communicate intimately and to express themselves with a degree of familiarity that most of them could never attain in the Spanish of their surroundings. Ultimately, however, it was Austro-German Jewish bourgeois society, which is sort of the cultural end product of 19th century Jewish emancipation in Central Europe, that provided the new arrivals with a model for emulation and a common locus for identification in their place of refuge. They did it, of course, not physically reconstruct, as one person called it, Little Vienna or Little Hamburg in the Andes. One joking refugee always referred to as Little Hamburg or Little Vienna. The Austrian and German communities that were established in La Paz, in Cochabamba, in Oruro, in Sucre, all of these were, in a sense, very, very Germanic-centered in terms of language. But a glance through the refugee-founded German language newspaper, the Rundschau from Limani, which was founded in 1939, if you look through the Rundschau from Limani, it illustrates both the range of the immigrants' economic and institutional adjustment in Bolivia, and confirms the character of their symbolic reconnection with Central Europe. So advertisements are a good way to look at that. If you go through the advertisements, there are advertisements for a Café Vienna, for a Club Metropole, for a Pensión Europa, and for other eateries like these. Then there are advertisements for Viennese pastries and culinary pleasures from back home, for made-to-order or secondhand clothing in the latest European styles, for a German language bookstore and a rental library listing editions of authors such as Franz Werfel or Stefan Zweig, for cabaret theater presenting performances of German classics and Viennese dialect skits, for a refugee-organized Collegium Musicum with chamber music concerts and recitals played by musicians, some of whom had been trained in conservatories in Vienna and Prague and Berlin. All of these are more illustrate the creative uses of cultural memory on the part of the refugees to reinforce their sense of cultural and historical continuity. But cultural memory in its nostalgic manifestations, the selective emphasis on what was positive in the past, was really only one layer of refugee recall. Critical memory, memory incorporating what was negative and bitter from their immediate past, was always present as well. It was, in a sense, nostalgia's complicating other side. And it also became a prominent creative force and influence within Bolivian refugee society. Indeed, at one level, critical memory of persecution that they experienced or that they remembered was the overarching framework of refugee collective identity in Bolivia. Within a present clouded by displacement, by insecurity, by war, this was a connective tissue of their refugeehood, the ubiquitous bond that obliterated many differences among them. It also added a distinctly political dimension to their institutions and to their culture and community. If nothing else, this political dimension affirmed that even though they had all been victimized, they had neither been crushed nor extinguished, and we can talk about this later on. Now, we, the children of the refugees, through our immersion into the language and cultural universe of our parents and of their fellow immigrants, also came to feel a certain nostalgia for places and lifeways that most of us have never known in their actual setting, places that we encountered only as already nostalgic reconstructions in a situation of displacement. I now recognize that the nostalgic memory engendered in me and others of my generation, the second generation or generation 1.5, whatever you want to call it, was indeed what might be identified as a kind of rootless nostalgia. It was sort of nostalgia about nostalgia, so to speak. Unlike our parents, our nostalgia was not the sort of the classic Heimweh, the homesickness, this pained longing for an estranged native land or a land of lost origin. It was also certainly not a yearning for at our age for irretrievable youth, for some better bygone time, for a world of yesterday, Stefan Zweig called it. But it did reflect a desire to establish a connection between a past known only secondhand and a lived present. It represented, I think, our need to repair a ruptured fabric of a painfully discontinuous, of a fragmentary history, even while we acknowledge the impossibility of this kind of repair. And yet, the over there European world that was explicitly or implicitly conveyed to us children also came laced with strong feelings of ambivalence and negativity. The critical negative memories carried by our parents and their fellow refugees, their anger, their bitterness, their insecurity, their sense of estrangement were also transmitted to us. It couldn't have been otherwise. How would it have been possible for recent refugees from Nazi terror to insulate the traumatic aspects of their past experiences in Europe and the intense fear about the future from their children? The people who were around me and with whom I had the most intimate contact spoke with one another, and in my presence as a child, about cruelty and persecution, about the war and relatives left behind, about loss and destruction, about Nazis and Hitler. I was a young boy during the war years, certainly. I didn't understand everything that they spoke about at the time, but something about the darkness of their tone and the strain in their voices did not escape me. The truly sort of frightening, violent, sadistic aspects of a world reflected in whispered adult conversation became, for a child of refugees in the early 1940s, a shadow within my imagination. Europe, that culture of Europe, was a lost origin that was somehow steeped in some form of nostalgia, but it was also really a fount for my nightmares. And we, the children of refugees, were also the ones who had the most intimate everyday contact with Bolivians and the culture of the land in which we lived. Although we conversed in German with our parents and other refugees, Spanish was a native language for us. We were taught in Spanish in our schools. We learned about Bolivian history and about Murillo and about Bolivar and about Sucre, about the heroes of the independence struggle against Spain. We read La Razón and the Última Hora, the newspapers, the Bolivian newspapers. We listened to Radio Fides, which was a radio station that played classical music, and also had a program that the refugees had once a week, a program put on by the refugees. We read La Razón. We had Bolivian friends with whom we played. With pleasure, we also anticipated and joined in the festivities during carnivals, during the fairs that were annual in La Paz, during Bolivian patriotic holidays. We loved the food, salteñas and empanadas, the many delicious foods made with Andean potatoes, with corn, with spicy ají and locoto. We cheered and became followers of local and national soccer teams. We were awed by the natural splendor of our surroundings, by the beauty of Mount Illimani, of Lake Titicaca. If you've ever been to Bolivia, you would know what an incredibly beautiful land it is. But despite the fact that many of us were Bolivian citizens by birth, with potentially greater access than our parents to the social spheres and to the folkways of the Bolivian Spanish-speaking middle classes and ruling elites, we remained in a kind of state of suspension, culturally somewhere in between. Even as a young child, the uprootedness of my parents and their fellow refugees reinforced a feeling in me that I did not truly belong in the place where I was born, that my origins lay elsewhere, and that I was not really at home. We can talk about it later if you want. Thank you.
Leo, thank you. Thank you very much. So fascinating to hear about Bolivia. We're now going to move northward to Mexico, where a lot is always known and said about Mexico's absorption of refugees from the Spanish Civil War during the 1930s, and not as much as is said about Jewish refugees who made their way to Mexico around the same time and before then, and then during World War II. So I'm going to hand off the discussion now to Yael to elucidate us on this.
Thank you, Simon. My presentation focuses more on the 30s and 40s, but I can certainly talk later about the Jewish community before that time. Latin America and the Caribbean became an important refuge for Jews in the second half of the 1930s and the early 1940s. It has been estimated that between 90 and 100,000 Jews emigrated to the region between the rise of Nazism and the end of the war. Several thousand more continued to arrive after the Holocaust. While this phenomenon has been largely studied, the main focus, at least in the case of Mexico, has been the governmental immigration policy towards Jewish refugees. Only more recently, increasing attention has been given to the refugees as subjects of this global and transnational history. One might think that within the region, Mexico was a very important haven for Jewish refugees. Mexico was a large country in the process of developing its industry and acquiring political stability following its revolution, therefore constituting a land of opportunities. Mexico had a Jewish community of about 10,000 people in the 1930s and close to 18,000 in the 1940s. Thus, through its institutional network and representatives, it could help the refugees. Mexico also had a geographical position that allowed the arrival of Jews escaping Nazism. both through the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Mexico could also be a springboard for Jews trying to immigrate to the United States. Nevertheless, the reality was very different. Mexico received one of the smallest numbers of Jewish refugees, only between 1,800 and 2,200. Scholars like Judith Boxer and Daniela Glaser have offered important explanations for this surprising outcome. They have argued that both the government of President Lázaro Cárdenas and Manuel Ávila Camacho gave priority to a national policy of ethnic homogenization based on mestizaje, in English, miscegenation, in which Jews were among the most, or rather the most, non-assimilable and undesirable group. In addition, a strong nationalist feeling combined with rivalries between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Interior, where anti-Jewish prejudice prevailed, account for Mexico's highly restrictive and selective immigration policy towards Jews. Indeed, in April 1934, the Ministry of Interior circulated a confidential memorandum that formally prohibited the entry of Jews to Mexico. A more restrictive policy was also expressed by Mexico and other Latin American countries at the 8th Pan American Conference in Lima, Peru, in 1938, to justify the need to maintain such restrictions in their respective laws. Even in this challenging and unempathetic context, some lucky Jewish refugees were able to arrive to Mexico. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they immigrate to Mexico? How were they able to enter the country? Did they stay? When and how did Mexico become a home to them? In an ongoing research project with my colleague Daniela Glaser, we have found that an important number of Jewish refugees came from Austria, Germany, and France between 1938 and 1942. Many of them entered Mexico as political refugees, and with the support of organizations such as the Society for Culture and Aid, the Jewish Labor Committee in New York, and the Emergency Rescue Committee, among many others. International personalities such as Anna Segers, Leo Zuckerman, and Leo Katz, among others, were part of this group. A much smaller number arrived to Mexico independently, that is, with their own means and contact. The Vogel family, for example, wanted to go to the United States, where they had family, but they ended up in Mexico after a long journey from Europe to Asia, thanks to the help of the Polish consul in India. Only when arriving in Mexico, they had the support of the Central Jewish Agency. The largest number, however, came to Mexico through family networks. These networks function independently or in interaction with international and local organizations. It is important to mention that the Mexican law allowed the entry of close relatives, and thus the actions of family members were essential. They applied for visas, became sponsors, and contacted local politicians or lawyers. When visas were finally granted and reached the recipients, these family members welcomed the refugees in the ports of Veracruz and Tampico, the train station in Nuevo Laredo, or Mexico City's airport. They simultaneously turned into immigration helpers and hosts. Although Mexico was not the preferred choice of most Jewish refugees, many were able to adapt to the country. Hardships included learning Spanish, finding a job or school, obtaining a work permit, and changing their migration condition. The process of adaptation, acculturation, and integration was not immediate, nor smooth. But in contrast to other Latin American countries, the majority stayed. Mexico, similar to Chile and Colombia, but perhaps unlike Bolivia or Dominican Republic, became a place of material and symbolic rootedness, fixity, and territoriality. In this regard, Juliette Levy, originally from France, remembers that despite her unfortunate initial encounter with the port of Veracruz, she finally felt Mexican. Among the few who left Mexico, we find some who emigrated in the first years after the war, mainly for ideological, social, or also family reasons. This was the case of some Austrian and German Jewish intellectuals who returned to their countries of origin to rebuild the political systems and national societies. Anna Segers, for example, is one of them. But some left Mexico because they were unable to adapt to the country's social hierarchy or its cultural norms. Stephen Calmar, for example, reached Mexico as a correspondent of the newspaper Nighted. He was helped by both the Matteotti Comité, a Swedish refugee committee, and the Jewish Welfare Committee. In his memoir, Goodbye Vienna, Calmar recalls that despite all the beauty he and his wife found in Mexico and the many friendships they made, they were unable to put down roots. They could never get used to the difference in social classes. Quote, "We had become Mexican citizens, but we had not set down roots. We had not found a new home." A few others left many years later, either because of personal factors, marriage, education, or work opportunities, or due to the political and economic crisis that has characterized Mexico's sexenios, the 6-year term of every government. It should be remembered that Mexico is not, and it has not been, a country of immigration. According to Pablo Yankelevich, foreigners have represented less than 1% of the national population. At the same time, however, Mexico has offered political asylum to several groups, as Simon mentioned, the Spanish Republicans during the Civil War, the Chilean exile during the Pinochet dictatorship, and Guatemalan refugees escaping the genocide in the early 1980s. Following Mexico's participation at the refugee conference in Evian in July 1938, and the position presented by Mexican diplomats at the League of Nations to condemn the invasion of weak countries by stronger ones, in particular the Anschluss, applications for asylum to Mexico by Jewish refugees significantly increased, but the majority were denied. Those who arrived to Mexico did not find a virulent anti-Semitism, but remember feeling the other foreigner. Alberto Bejarano, a child survivor who emigrated to Mexico with his family from Bulgaria, noted, quote, "For a certain period of time, we were not happy here. Of course, we were foreigners. My parents' Spanish was rusty. It was Ladino." Bejarano's experience is not exceptional among Jewish refugees in Mexico, but it seems to contrast with the testimonies of Jewish refugees who arrived to Chile, where, according to oral historian Nancy Nichols, mass European immigration had led to a multi-ethnic society with a de facto tolerance toward minorities, thus counterbalancing the primordial, territorial, and religiously homogeneous profile that the state aspired to achieve. To end this presentation, I would like to mention that although Mexico held a rejectionist position towards Jewish refugees during the 30s and 40s, and despite the hardships experienced by the refugees themselves, a dominant narrative of open doors took shape and has prevailed even until today. When the war ended, different Latin American countries tried to justify their behavior during the Holocaust. In 1945, the Mexican government declared that it had always combated racial discrimination, and that the international policy of Mexico had been based on the equality of all men and races. In 1947, when the UN resolution to partition Palestine was voted, Mexico abstained. In reference to the Holocaust, the Mexican representative declared that the government had not raised its voice in a timely manner against such barbaric procedure, but that it had opened its doors to millions of refugees, overcoming great economic and demographic difficulties. While the Mexican Jewish community felt offended with the government's discourse, it did not deny it. Since then, there have been multiple references to Mexico's open doors towards the Jewish refuge by the Mexican government, academics, filmmakers, journalists, historians, and even the Jewish leadership. The reasons seem to be mainly political. In the present context, when Mexico is not only a country of emigration and immigration, but also a place of transit by Central American caravans, refugees from Haiti, Venezuela, and African countries, looking at the Jewish experience during the Holocaust might help us understand the profound and long-lasting implications of an immigration policy of rejection and denial, as well as the need to question the dominant narrative of Mexico's open doors. Even the writer Anna Segers, who obtained a Mexican visa in Marseille, faced a so-called paper wall in a moment of extreme danger. Through the voice of Marie, the main character in her book Transit, she explains, quote, How could the consuls make a mistake? Not a detail is left out from your passport, not even a sentence in your file. If only one word were missing, they would prefer to retain here 100 righteous before letting pass a mistaken one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yael. Such wonderful presentations from all of you, you know, there are common themes, and then there are themes which are unique to each country. And one of the factors behind everything that happened in each of these places seems to be what was also happening in the United States in the 1920s and 30s at that time. And Marian, you touched on this in your wonderful presentation on the role of State Department personnel and the Roosevelt administration at the time, and their approach to receiving refugees from Europe. Can you walk us through a little bit what was happening in the US in the 20s and 30s that then led to this influx of refugees into different parts of Latin America?
If I walk you through briefly, I would start with the fact that the State Department was made up of what today we would call white supremacists. These are people who did not like Jews and did not want more Jews in the United States at all. And someone, I think Adriana mentioned the 1924 Exclusion Act of people from the South and East of Europe. So that was one thing. Roosevelt was an agnostic on that. He didn't really care. He also didn't want to offend the anti-Semites. He was, you know, a politician, and this was also a period, the 30s, of the Great Depression. They didn't want more people vying for jobs. So I think and I should add, the US had its thumb on the Dominican Republic. It had taken over the Dominican Republic in 1916, and then it had a customs, not ownership, but it took over the customs in the Dominican Republic. So it also used its financial power in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic used $1, $5, and $10 bills, and they were very attached. So if the and all of these refugees had to go through Ellis Island, so they couldn't just land in the DR. So the US had a huge role in slowing it down. If you think that Evian and the invitation to Jews happened in late 38, and the first Jews come in mid to late 40, that's all about the State Department. Those Jews were ready to come. They were in Switzerland, they were in Lisbon, they were in England, they were all over. They were ready to come. They were even in Germany at that point. And they didn't come fast enough because the US slowed them down.
Amazing. And just stretching back a bit further, you know, I mean, I know that Argentina, you know, Adriana is a case apart just because of the size and diversity of its Jewish community and just the different waves of immigration from different parts of the world into Argentina, especially from the 1880s onward. But even before the big influx of Ashkenazi Jews into Argentina, there was a Sephardic community there that had begun moving to Argentina in the 19th century. Could you tell us a little bit about that community, and also how they got along with the Ashkenazi Jews who came later?
Yes. So thank you for the question, and thank you. I mean, these have just been wonderful presentations to all our panelists. There is a significant number of Sephardic Jews in Argentina. The largest group of non-Ashkenazi immigrants to Argentina were actually the Arabic speakers. And so I was going to start by saying, you know, well, Sephardi Jews are going to choose Latin America because they speak Spanish, or Ladino, right? A sort of an old Spanish that might have made, you know, their adaptation to these new countries much easier, right? Much more easily than those who spoke Yiddish or non-Spanish languages. And yet the largest group of non-Ashkenazi Jews who settled in Argentina were Arabic speakers from Aleppo and from Damascus. But there were other Jews that certainly, you know, made their choice about where to go precisely because the ability, right, the linguistic ability, right, with which they could perhaps find niches, right, in which it would be much more easier for them to integrate with that linguistic advantage. And so actually the first group of Sephardim that arrive in Argentina are Moroccan Jews who had been leaving much earlier in the 1820s and heading over. These are Spanish speaking from Spanish Morocco who were heading on to Brazil, to the region of the Amazon, in this boom that the Amazon region was having due to
Rubber.
yes,
Rubber.
the rubber boom in Belen. And so a lot of them from Morocco moved to the Amazon, and then many, moved from there to Venezuela, and also then to Argentina, as these countries, Argentina and Venezuela, are ending that process of internal civil wars that I made reference to, and can begin to participate in the actual nation-making process, right, that these nations embark upon, and able to capitalize on their being there first, and their being, able to set up, networks of trade, both some with their families, the people from Syria and Aleppo and Damascus had created a huge network of textile production that included members of families living in Manchester, England, and connecting to some of their family members that settled in Buenos Aires, and creating, right, these trade networks. The Moroccans also, to a much smaller degree, just, having families settle down in Buenos Aires, but then sending nephews or uncles, to other parts of Argentina in, right, these circulation of products that enable them to move alongside the railroads and sort of, participate in these trade networks. And of course, right, we have all the problems in the former Ottoman Empire, right, as the Ottoman Empire collapses, and Jews are increasingly found, right, problematic for these new nations that get created in the Balkans, that a lot of Ladino speakers in that region also think about moving to, not just because it's the only place that they can go, but choosing to go, right, to a place that had, like Argentina, very open policies for immigrants. And so there's a part of me that I think, we need to fight against that idea that, Latin America only receives those people that wanted to go elsewhere, right, where we have a lot of structural realities that made, for many, Latin America their choice, their number one choice. And so I think it's important to think about that. And Sephardim, because of their connection to Spanish language, to Spanish culture, found also a cultural connection, right, to this region that maybe made them think of countries in Latin America as their first option, rather than an English-speaking country that might have had a lot of problems. And definitely after 1924, right, a world that was, closed to them.
Oh, interesting. Something else that struck me during the presentations was that we had these incredibly vibrant communities in places like Bolivia or in Sosua in the Dominican Republic that are almost, not quite, of course, but almost non-existent today. And just how quickly things change, and cycling in, cycling out. So Leo, I was hoping maybe you could touch on what happened to the community in Bolivia. I mean, it was interesting that, one of the main, in your book, you mentioned how that one of the main Jewish newspapers in Buenos Aires paid very close attention to the community in Bolivia, providing updates for their readers on what was happening. Did some of them end up moving to Argentina? Did most move to the US? Where did folks go?
Well, the emigration began almost right away. That is, Bolivia being one of the few countries that was still open for immigration in 38, 39, allowed actually the permission that Herman Bush, who was then the dictator of Bolivia, he made a deal that about 50,000 would be allowed into Bolivia. But he was then assassinated at the end of 39. By that point, there were close to 20,000 that had already come in. But a number of people that came into Bolivia came in because they would then go out the back door and go back into Argentina or go into those countries that they considered to be more European, more somehow more friendly to what their cultural beliefs were. So almost right away, people were beginning to go. But the general sort of emigration came after the war, particularly for the German-speaking Jews. There was a second immigration to Bolivia after the war, which are Eastern European Jews, many of them camp survivors or relatives of others who had already been in Bolivia. But the sort of original German-speaking community began to move out after the war. And they if you ask them, sort of the general thing was, oh, well, we can't find any political entree here, even though Bolivia was extremely very generous to us economically, allowing us to get jobs and to expand jobs and so on and so forth. We could not move in socially. The opportunities elsewhere are better, life chances are better, there's the unpredictability of local politics, a number of these things, but also the possibilities that then emerged after the war for people who had originally, for example, applied for visas to the U.S. and couldn't get into the U.S. and then wound up in Bolivia as a substitute. It saved their lives, but it was for them, for many of them, it was a substitute. Or people who wanted to return to Europe after the war, to Austria, to Germany, the socialists, the communists who wanted to rebuild those countries that had been the Nazi countries. So there were a number of people who went back to Austria, to Germany. Others were made these deals like my parents, which is really to reconstitute what was left of the family. And the idea was at that point that to reconstitute it where it was possible, and at that point it became the United States. So the move was out of Bolivia to the United States in order to reconstitute what was left.
Oh, interesting. And Yael, you touched on something in your presentation about Mexico right now, similar to as it was in the 30s and 40s, is a theater for these global migration patterns, right? You have many families from other parts of Latin America, especially Central America, that find their future in Mexico. Many more are passing through Mexico. How does the experience of Jewish migration to Mexico, on the eve of World War II, even during World War II, how does that resonate now, given what's happening in the country? Thank you. I don't think enough. This is not a history that is taught in schools. It's not part of the curricula. There are no courses taught at the university level either. Not enough public conferences about this topic. So it seems to me that they're like parallel histories, not interconnected ones, at least publicly. So yeah, that's why I ended the presentation saying, hopefully, we could look at this case study and learn the lessons, the important lessons for the present. Mm-hmm. Adriana, going back to something that you mentioned about those early agricultural communities on the Pampas in Argentina, I visited one of those places, Moisesville, and I was in awe, really. I mean, I was taken into these theaters which had these Yiddish troops coming in the 20s and 30s. There were schools. There's still magnificent libraries with incredible collections. And yet almost all of the families have moved away, and these buildings were, if not crumbling, they were at the start of a process of decay. I'm just so curious. It's been about a decade since I've been there. What do they look like today, these places where Jews first settled on the Pampas in Argentina?
So yes, so just a very brief description, as you said, they were literally Jewish enclaves of Yiddish speakers in the middle of the Pampas in Argentina, right? There were shochet. I mean, there were all the Jewish institutions that you would find in small shtetl in Europe, right? So the school, the library, the theater, the actual economic, the cooperatives that were created, you know, as people pooled their resources together in an effort to make more money out of their agricultural products. You know, we know that Molly Picon, right, a very renowned and famous star of the Yiddish theater, traveled right to Argentina, and she did, right. I mean, so the circulation within the Yiddishkeit, right. So within the Yiddish word, it did include, right, these small Jewish agricultural communities in Argentina. We also know that at some point, as you know, these first generations who struggled and who were able to make a living and recreate the Jewish institutions on these foreign lands, for their children, they wanted a university degree. And so the first or maybe second generation of Argentine Jews left for the towns and left for the universities to, I'm not saying most, I'm not saying all, but definitely many just sought the cities, and they then, people with university degrees, they just decided to settle in. And so some of these communities are today almost empty of Jewish people, or right, families that became integrated. And so you have families that are not exclusively Jewish, but Jewish and people of other faiths. And yet there is a sense that that is part of a culture, part of a tradition that needs to be preserved. And so there is the intention, right, of raising money to rebuild, right, the theaters and the libraries. But it is, right, in a sense, it's become a museum, a live, you know, kind of a living museum to an experience that that is not Jewish anymore, because most Jews have left.
Mm. Can I just add sort of the Bolivian dimension of this? The visas that were granted to the immigrants coming in the late 30s were actually stipulating for immigrants to do work in Bolivia and to contribute different skills. And that was one of the attractions for Bush and others to bring in these refugees after the huge Bolivian losses in the Chaco War. He wanted to bring in people who could modernize Bolivia, help modernize. But among the desires were to bring in agricultural experts. And of course, very few of the Central European Jews that came in were agriculturalists. You know, they came in from cities. Most of them were urban immigrants. So the agriculturalists were, in a sense, encouraged in Bolivia itself. Some people should become agriculturalists, and the Joint and some of the wealthy patrons decided they would try to create agricultural communities in the Yungas, which is the lowlands of Bolivia, you know, thousands of feet below La Paz. And they brought in Argentine experts on farming and so on and so forth to try to establish these agricultural communities. And these agricultural communities brought in initially a number of people. Houses were built and they started growing coffee and all these other goods, but they were extreme failures. First of all, the transportation problem from the Yungas up to La Paz at that point was just horrendous. Took forever and also extremely dangerous. And then, you know, the people wanted to do other things. So these agriculture communities faded out. And all you find now, like in Argentina, except smaller, are these sort of skeletons of old places that were settled by Jews in the 40s. And you know.
Interesting. I just, you know, have one more kind of like open question for anyone on the panel who wants to take it up. And it's just also, you know, just from, you know, my reporting and traveling around Latin America, one of the things that I noticed in different countries was a kind of, and different members of the panel have mentioned this, but a kind of cross-pollination between Jewish communities from one country to another, you know, and Argentina was a place which was sharing a lot of knowledge. It might have been a place where people had relatives. It might have been a place where families from some countries might also move to. During the harshest days of Argentina's dictatorship, a lot of Jews from Argentina moved to Brazil, where conditions were somewhat milder, or to Venezuela. I found especially, you had large communities of Argentine, Uruguayan, Colombian Jews who moved to Venezuela when democracy was kind of flourishing there. Conditions have changed right now, of course, in the region, and I just wonder where any of you see the future of Jewish life in Latin America heading. I mean, so many people are migrating to Miami, for instance, or to the other parts of the United States. Where is it heading in your view?
I just spoke, but I was very specifically, Bolivia right now, for example, has probably less than 1,000 Jews, and that population is shrinking. The cemetery in La Paz is now closed. There's a Jewish cemetery, very beautifully located. It's a very, very diminishing society in Bolivia, and yet there is this incredible memory of it. So I think the connections are really in terms of a memory of a time, and a collectivity that sort of lives in that memory.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
I could add something as well. I wanted to just say there's also a tiny town in the DR, which was founded in the mid-19th century by a Jewish financier, and it's still called La Judea. So there's even like a Jewish town in the DR. Today, there are 3,000 Jews in the DR, but that doesn't really give you the number, because there were so many intermarriages that there are many people that come up to you and say, oh, I have a Jewish grandmother, or they use the word Hebrea again. But so it has been a lot of intermarriage, and there is a sense of being Jewish, but it doesn't really mean a Jewish community. And there is a smaller Jewish community in Santo Domingo, and there is a very, very tiny, beautiful synagogue, but tiny community in Sosua. And most of their kids and grandkids are in Florida, as somebody just said. Yeah.
Maybe I should say that Mexico is contrasting because it has a vibrant Jewish community of about 40,000 Jews. If you think about the total number of the country's population, is a very tiny minority, but it has plenty of institutions, educational, religious, cultural. It's called a community of communities also. I think it's very different from other Jewish communities in the region, because it's formed by not only Sephardic and Ashkenazis, but also Jews who came from mainly Syria. And they're also subdivided between those who came from Damascus or Aleppo. So we have 4 communities within a community. So and the emigration from Mexico, even though it has happened, from the Jewish community, I think it hasn't been as significant as in other countries. And then people who leave, then they return. So I think that's a very different case.
Mm. Great. We have just a window of time, a short window of time for audience Q&A, and so I'm going to start with a couple of questions now. The first one that we got from one of our audience members is: were the Jews in South America aware of the Nazis who escaped there after the war? And if so, what were the repercussions? And this is open for any of the panel members who'd like to address it.
Okay. Does everybody want to? Well, the Nazis that fled there after the war were people, of course, who were helped initially in the so-called rat line to find havens in South America. They were generally Nazis who were specialists in the beginning of the Cold War, and who would come out with specialists in Soviet affairs. So Klaus Barbie, who wound up in Bolivia, was probably the most famous of some of these groups because of the trial. He was an expert on Soviet affairs, and he helped to get to Bolivia through the Rat Line, which was a system actually in which the U.S. Secret Service and other secret services played a role to bring in these people who would then know how to deal with the Soviets. And the Nazi community in Bolivia, but certainly, or the German community in Bolivia was an early community. The Germans helped develop, like in a lot of other parts of Latin America, air traffic. They were involved in all kinds of activities, and there was an active Nazi party in the 30s in La Paz. And it was really only at the very moment of where a decision had to be made by the government whether they would go with the Allies or whether they would go with the Germans. The Germans were very eager to establish themselves in South America during the war. They wanted the resources, and there was this kind of Secret Service fight between the U.S. and the Axis powers, in which, in this case, Bolivia came in on the Allied side rather than the Axis side. But it could have gone the other way. There were a lot of Germans, and there was a lot of German support in Bolivia, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism as a consequence. The Germans who were in Bolivia and who were sympathetic to Nazism stirred up a lot of anti-Semitism, in particular when the large numbers of refugees came in.
Great. Another question that we have from the audience is, and this is a very telling question, did immigrants feel like they had to hide that they were Jews when they arrived in some of these countries? And again, any panelist can take this one up.
Certainly in Argentina, they did not. Argentina, as I mentioned, right, was one of it's perhaps the country that received the largest immigration of Jews in the southern part, Rio Grande South. And so, just strengthening numbers, right? But even in the small little towns in which, their presence would definitely have been, just reduced to a handfuls. It was never, there was never a sense that they had to hide who they were. They build, their institutions, their synagogues, their cemeteries. And even though there might have occasionally been some nationalists who, might have complained about their presence, that never really dissuaded people from just hiding who they were. But again, I think that, Argentina is an exception in that the community was large enough that the Jews didn't feel like they were alone. Although in the largest scheme of things, the Jewish community is the smallest number, the smallest in terms of percentage of the national society.
I may add that in Mexico, I don't think people physically hid, but they did hide their identity, and they did hide, their identity, and we're starting to find more and more stories that talk about that. So they were not affiliated with the Jewish community, they changed their names. So there is much to study still about this population. For example, there is an intellectual, Rodolfo Stavenhagen, who was the child of refugees coming, I believe, from Austria, or Germany. I'm not entirely sure, but he became a very leading, an important personality for the defense of indigenous rights, but he did not lead a Jewish life. And so I'm sure we would find more and more stories. We just have to look for them.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And another great question is, can someone address the role of Gilberto Bosques, Mexico's ambassador to France, who issued, I guess, as many as 1,700 visas to Jews fleeing Europe? I guess, Jael.
Yes, I myself haven't done research about Gilberto Bosques, but my colleague Daniela Glaser has extensively, and she has found a very important historical data that actually questions this myth of Gilberto Bosques as a big hero or a rescuer of Jewish refugees. So what she's found mainly is that he granted visas to political refugees, yes, but in accordance to the policy of President Cárdenas, not going against his will. But in the case of Jews, he granted visas to Jews who were political refugees, who were left-wing, but not necessarily to refugees who were Jews, so who were escaping racial and persecution. But people can read her article that was published maybe a few years ago if they're interested.
Great. And another question from our audience, and I think Leo, you touched on this somewhat, but maybe some of our other panelists can look at this. But why were Jews told to work in agriculture versus in other industries when they immigrated to many Latin American countries? Why the emphasis on agriculture? Adriana.
I can just very briefly, in the case of Argentina, remember that the agricultural colonies were created by the European Jewish Colonization Association, which was founded by Baron Hirsch, multi-billionaire, Jewish multi-billionaire, who believed that this was a way to regenerate the image of the Jew as a downtrodden, religious, unable to be productive to society. And Hirsch imagined that through the work of agriculture, Jews could show that their work could contribute to the growth of societies. And so in Argentina, in particular, a country that was emerging from this nation building process and embarking on a lot of agricultural production that would give them tons of money, the Jews were, Jews and Argentina opened their doors to all sorts of agricultural communities that came from all over Europe, because their intention was to produce. But this was connected, right, with this sense that Hirsch had of the need to recreate the image of the Jew as a productive member of society. And agriculture was one of the ways in which that could be shown, as well as whitening, right? I mean, these countries are going to be very interested in the role that Jews could play in whitening the population and ridding it, right, of its indigenous and Black communities.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Thank you so much, everyone, for just such wonderful presentations, wonderful insight, and fantastic questions from our audience. I just really appreciate it. With that, I'll hand it back off to Sydney Yeager.
Yeah, I would like to echo what Simon said. This was a really amazing presentation to listen to. I certainly learned a lot, and I would also like to thank Simon for moderating today. And I would like to thank the Hispanic Society again for co-presenting this program with us. And to all of you out there, everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. To those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out at the link in the Zoom chat. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you again to all of our panelists. This was really great. Have a great afternoon. Bye.